Mario. After much hesitation, I've decided to gather here all the elements regarding your birth and my connection to your mother and to my country. I don't know if you will read these pages one day. They have no goal other than to bring you back to me. My dearest wish is that your mind never be troubled by reading this.
The man writing to his son is Federico Strobino. He was about to tell his child about meeting his mother, Rima, during the Second World War. It's the story of love at first sight between an Italian officer and a young Jewish woman of Russian origin in the mountains between France and Italy. Federico's story begins in 1939. He was 24 at the time. War broke out on September 1st. Mussolini's fascist Italy, allied with Nazi Germany, was still reluctant to take part in it. And the young student finished his exams, then returned to Mosso Santa Maria, his village in Piedmont, for his sister's marriage, where he was reunited with the whole Strobino family. Federico had got a master's in economics, at his father's request. But his true passions lay elsewhere. Natural sciences, geography. He'd held on to the poetry of nature, from his childhood in the lee of the mountains of northern Italy. The young man he'd become was still as curious and melancholic as ever, and dreamed of voyages and adventure. As the time had come for him to join the army, he chose the military school in Palermo, in Sicily, for its picturesque landscapes at the other end of the country.
I remember that I couldn't stand the life in the barracks. It was unbearable, and my companions already knew how to use weapons. Having trained in fascist organizations with which I had almost never been in contact. And I hated this stupid discipline. It went against my nature.
He also missed not being free to listen to the news on the radio. So on June 10th, 1940, he escaped from the barracks and in a city square, listened to the dictator Mussolini finally declare war on France and Great Britain.
Scendiamo in campo contro le democrazie plutocratiche e reazionarie dell'Occidente che in ogni tempo hanno ostacolato la marcia e spesso insidiato l'esistenza medesima del popolo italiano.
After the declaration, I was awestruck by the complete silence of the crowd filling the square. It was different from the usual expressions of joy. When I got back to the barracks, I showed no enthusiasm about this declaration, but someone said to me, "Shut up, with Germany we'll win."
The Italian army attacked its Latin sister, France, already sent to her knees by the Germans. The Battle of the Alps ended with the Italians' victory a few days later. On June 24, 1940, France signed an armistice with Fascist Italy. The French delegation arrived in Rome in an airplane, which made things very clear, 2 days after signing a peace treaty with Nazi Germany. France was divided into the zone occupied by the German army, the Free Zone controlled by the Vichy government, and a small band of territory, 13 municipalities, occupied by Italy. That was a bit frustrating for Il Duce, whatever the news said during his visit to France.
Sull'aspro terreno della lotta, il Duce, comandante supremo delle forze d'Italia, passa in rassegna le truppe vittoriose. Superbo spiegamento di giovinezza guerriera. La patria può essere fiera di questi suoi figli in armi, temprati nel cuore e nei muscoli da 20 anni di fascismo.
Called to the French border, Cadet Federico Strobino finally left military school in Palermo. On the way, he stopped to visit his family. His last very melancholic letter had his parents worried. Federico told his sister Leia about the start of the war as seen from Sicily. He said that all this would be over soon and got back on the road. At the end of the summer, he joined the GAF, Guardia alla Frontiera, in the Alps. His battalion's job was to patrol, to keep watch on the border.
Up there, you see France. You only see bare rock and the steep mountains, a bunch of rocks and loose stones. It's very cold. When I get a sweater, a windbreaker, or any kind of military trousers, I won't wear the uniform anymore. There's no point wearing it out.
A bit lower down, the 13 French municipalities occupied by his brothers-in-arms had undergone some Italian changes. Italian was the official and compulsory language. The Italian lira was the legal currency. Residents were given Italian ID cards. School was taught in Italian. Menton had become a showcase for the fascist empire.
Superato quello che per troppo tempo fu un iniquo confine, Mentone ci viene incontro festosa nello splendore solare della sua riviera incantata.
Mussolini felt that fascist Italian civilization had a lot to teach democratic, decadent France. Strobino didn't seem particularly concerned by French decadence. Up in the mountains, he sometimes even had lunch with the French soldiers. He was now a detachment commander. That meant that he had a cook, a dining room, and even a library. He read, wrote some letters, smoked 5 or 6 cigarettes a day, worked little, and skied a lot. So passed those months spent watching the border until 1942.
My life in uniform on the Alpine border was a very healthy time, which made my body stronger. I devoted myself completely to Alpine life, which I truly loved, until I became the hardiest hiker and the best ski monitor among the officers. So, you see, my life before meeting your mother wasn't much to write home about.
The woman whose Throbino had not yet met was called Rima, a young Jewish woman whose red hair you'll have to imagine. She lived in Nice, in the free zone, with her parents and her little sister. She was born the same year as Federico, in Orenburg, Russia. Fleeing the anti-Semitic pogroms, Rima and her family first emigrated to Berlin in the 1920s. Then, when Hitler came to power, they left Germany for France in 1934. Despite struggling with French, Rima graduated high school with honors. She worked in her father Gregory's factory in Nice. That's where she met Mordak Levin, a Russian Jew. They got married. Then Mordak emigrated to America, where he'd been desperately waiting for her since the beginning of the war. But Rima was a modern, independent young woman with a strong personality. Despite the love letters she received from America, she chose to stay in France. Except that in 1942, she could clearly see danger approaching. Since January and the start of the final solution, raids and deportations kept multiplying, including in the free zone. Gregory wondered if there was any safe place left for his daughters. Every morning on the way to the dye factory, he bought the paper. And in November 1942, he saw the war map shaken up. Anglo-American troops had landed in North Africa. Hitler feared new attacks in the Mediterranean. He wanted at all costs to prevent a landing on the Côte d'Azur. On November 11th, the Germans invaded the free zone, making sure to hold on to strategic points, Lyon, Avignon, Marseille, and let their Italian allies have a bigger part of southeastern France.
Truppe dell'asse, per ordine del Duce e del Führer, procedono all'occupazione del litorale francese e della cosiddetta zona non occupata. Ingresso delle truppe italiane a Nizza.
Rima watched them parading in the streets. She thought, at least it's better than having the Germans here. But her family remained vigilant, because in Italy, anti-Semitic laws had been passed in 1938. Jews were excluded from many trades, and thousands of foreign Jews had already been deported.
L'ebraismo mondiale è stato durante 16 anni, malgrado la nostra politica, un nemico irreconciliabile del fascismo.
And yet, starting in December 1942, the Italian authorities in France seemed to be applying a completely different policy. And throughout the whole zone, there were soon whispers that the Italians were protecting the Jews. Every day, hundreds of refugees fleeing Nazi persecution arrived in Nice. They went straight to the Refugee Aid Committee, on Boulevard du Bouchage. Rima and her sister Vera went there often. They made friends with other young foreigners. The center provided new arrivals with documents, placing them under Italian protection. All this was possible thanks to the actions of one man, Jewish-Italian banker Angelo Donati. Thanks to his highly placed contacts in the army and diplomacy, he became a spokesman liaising with the Italian authorities. After he intervened, the Italians banned the transfer of all these Jewish foreigners to the Ardèche, in the German zone, as demanded by the Vichy government. Soon, these actions to help Jews spread throughout the whole Italian zone. In February 1943, the Alpini surrounded a barracks in Annecy, in which 8 Jewish foreigners were being held, and demanded their release. In Grenoble, in Chambéry, Italian officers prevented 50 deportations. The more this happened, the more Vichy was infuriated. Ribière, prefect of the Alpes-Maritimes, wrote a detailed report about how the Italians were constantly opposing measures taken by the French authorities against the Jews. When the German authorities learned of this, they were furious. Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, arrived in Rome on March 17, 1943. He demanded an explanation from Mussolini. Il Duce reassured him. The Italian generals were too sentimental, but he was in charge. From then on, the French police, too, could arrest Jews in the Italian zone. That night, Rima's fate and that of all the Jews in Nice seemed sealed. But a few hours later, several high-ranking diplomats arrived in Mussolini's office. Bastianini, the foreign minister, set a damning report on Il Duce's desk about the treatment of Jews in the eastern camps. These fascist diplomats told Mussolini, "Italy can't be associated with German crimes. Our honor is at stake." They had understood that Germany was going to lose, and they were already trying to ensure they'd have a good image with the Allies if they spared the Jews, to the extent that they could. Il Duce changed his mind. The Germans were summoned again. He was told that the Italians alone would decide the fate of the Jews in southeastern France after all. And instead of arresting them, they would instead place them in assigned residence in the mountains. A strange choreography started up. Jews from the Nice region, now numbering about 25,000, were spread among various Alpine ski resorts in the Haute-Savoie, in the Alpes de Haute-Provence, and in the Alpes-Maritimes, where in the spring of 1943, the village of Saint-Martin-Vésubie saw an influx of nearly 1,000 refugees in a village of 1,000 inhabitants. Rima came from Nice to Saint-Martin with her sister. They found refuge in the family chalet Villa Paradiso, where their parents, Rachel and Gregory, were waiting for them. They had been forced to abandon the dye factory. Other people arriving were assigned lodgings, some in the village hotels, some in private homes. For the poorest, the rent was paid by the Nice Refugee Aid Committee. The Jews under assigned residence could move freely around Saint-Martin-Vésubie. They just had to check in each morning and evening at the Italians' HQ at the Terminus Hotel. On April 10, 1943, Officer Federico Strobino was transferred to the 4th Sector, 2nd Command, 3rd Company of the GAF, which was headquartered in Saint-Martin-Vésubie.
I went from Lantosque to Saint-Martin-Vésubie at 967 meters altitude, a pretty tourist village in the valley of the same name. I took up residence in the Hôtel des Alpes. First conversation in French at the hotel. I bought a French dictionary. Saint-Martin is one of the assigned residence centers for hundreds of Jews who escaped being rounded up by the Nazis and their French allies, in a zone occupied by the Germans. In this green zone, which we control, the Jews have found a safe harbor with the Italian military and civil authorities. So, in fact, it's more of a reception center.
From the window of his hotel room in the Alps, Federico photographed the village's main square, where all the refugees he didn't know met and spoke Yiddish, French, Russian, German. Every morning, Rima and her sister went down the chestnut walk behind Villa Paradiso, then turned left onto the Berthemont Trail and arrived in the village. There, Rima taught children mathematics. After school, the young people held boxing classes with Big Charlie and acting workshops. Rima and Vera were reunited with their friends from the Nice committee. Manja Hartmeier and her brother Sigi come from Poland. Young Sigi, always cheerful, was unperturbed when he came across French gendarmes in the village, because he'd noticed that there were no weapons in their holsters, only cigarette butts. The Italians had told them, "You won't touch a single one of our Jews here." One might wonder why soldiers and civil authorities who belong to a racist state would be so tolerant towards the Jews here. The reasons are surely mundane. There's pragmatism, opportunism. It was a matter of maintaining a certain prestige, by showing that it was they, the Italians, who occupied this zone, making all their decisions completely independently of the Germans and the French. And there may also have been, in some of them, something which had nothing to do with politics, but which had to do with humanity.
We felt like we were all in the same boat, with the Jews in assigned residence. Of course, we couldn't go near them, because the racial laws forbade it. But let's say that surveillance wasn't very strict.
On April 16th, 1943, 12 days after his arrival, Officer Strobino set out on the Berthemont Trail. He'd been ordered to inspect Villa Paradiso.
Villa Paradiso is a lovely wooden building nestled in a little stand of chestnut trees. It belongs to the Drizzo family. I met Rima. She was born in Siberia. She's stateless, married to Modag Levin, of Russian nationality, who fled to America a few years ago. To me, she represented a new and extremely interesting world. Her intelligence and her grace, which she employed on this occasion, impressed me. To her, I was an elegant officer, whom intense sporting activities had made strong and pleasant to look at.
Federico returned to the little stand of chestnut trees, on the sly, 4 days later, on April 22nd, on the 25th, after having put out a fire, on May 3rd, on May 5th, and then on May 7th, on his way back from patrol.
That day, I wondered if I had fallen in love with Rima.
In the following weeks, whenever he could, he went to have lunch at Villa Paradiso, or met Rima in a secret location. The spring of 1943 was like a bubble sheltered from the world. That was true also for the other refugees in Saint-Martin who enjoyed themselves, laughed, flirted, learned Italian songs. For some, it was the first time they'd heard a piano since the beginning of the war.
Gira, rigira, biondina, l'amore, la vita, godere ci fa. Quando ti vedo piccina, il mio cor sempre fa ticchettà. Gira, rigira, biondina, l'amore, la vita, godere ci fa. Quando ti vedo piccina, il mio cor sempre fa ticchettà.
In all the assigned residences, the Jews saw this Italian period as the only moment of respite after months and years of hounding and persecution. Life gently resumed in these mountain resorts. Relations with the local population were sometimes more complex. Certain villages, like Saint-Martin, had one Jew in assigned residence for every local resident. Villages lacked resources. A black market emerged. A few local residents whispered that the arrival of these foreigners had driven up the price of bread. Others felt their presence was an invasion. The village priest exclaimed, "It's a ghetto." But many villagers, often the youngest, most carefree ones, were very enthusiastic about these new arrivals who spoke other languages, told them stories about regions of Europe which they didn't know, or held underground dances in barns. Young Jews and young people from the village met at night after curfew. Manya, Siji's sister, told Rima how happy she was here and how free. After having been in several internment camps in France, she finally felt loved. She felt like she was becoming human again. Manya and Rima went to their friend Ruth's wedding in the makeshift synagogue set up in a chalet. A few days later, one Thursday in July 1943, Rima met Federico in their secret location. She told him she was pregnant.
My love for your mother took on a new, infinitely more precious dimension. And it was a strange and a new source of joy for me. The joy of being able to give everything I could to you. But in that summer of '43, we couldn't make any plans for the future. It was a terribly hard time for everyone. War was raging. My country was devastated by English and American bombing. It was in agony. Italian masterpieces, ports and villages, everything was destroyed. The army put up no resistance to the Anglo-American landing in Sicily. We were boycotting the alliance with the Germans, which had been imposed on us by fascism.
And on July 25th, 1943, a coup d'etat led to the arrest of Mussolini. The old monarchist Marshal Badoglio became the head of the government.
At the barracks up there, I learned that fascism was no more. I was overjoyed. With Badoglio in power, there would likely now be an armistice in Italy. I ran to Saint-Martin to see Rima. There, the Jewish people were in an uproar. The Jews, in assigned residence, wanted to take refuge in Italy to escape the Germans.
Because Gregory, Rima's father, and many Jews in Saint-Martin could see the danger this political change held for them, they suspected that the Germans wouldn't long trust an Italy without Mussolini. They were already moving closer to the Italian zone, hoping to finally put a stop to this region whose freedom from their control made them enraged. The happy days are numbered, wrote a high-ranking member of the Vichy government about the Jews in the Italian zone. So hundreds and hundreds of refugees were already leaving their various assigned residences, heading for Nice, in the hopes of being transferred elsewhere. In Saint-Martin-Vésubie, members of the Jewish community studied possible escape routes to Italy.
Your mother and I often discussed this, and it seemed to us that these escape plans would strengthen our love. Perhaps at that time, the terrible anxiety about the war made it even more precious. I was always afraid you'd suddenly be torn from me.
Proclama del Capo del Governo. Parla Sua Eccellenza il Maresciallo Pietro Badoglio. Il governo italiano, riconosciuta la impossibilità di continuare la impari lotta contro la soverchiante potenza avversaria, nell'intento di risparmiare ulteriori e più gravi sciagure alla nazione, ha chiesto un armistizio al generale Eisenhower, comandante in capo delle forze alleate anglo-americane. La richiesta è stata accolta.
At the Hotel des Alpes, immediately after Badoglio's declaration, I left the village. I went back to the barracks. Bedlam and general rejoicing reigned. We were free. My reserve had completely disappeared. But we didn't know what to do. We hadn't received any orders. After the proclamation, we understood just one thing, that the Anglo-Americans were no longer our enemy, that our friends were no longer our friends, and so, in short, that from that moment on, the Germans had to be considered potential enemies. The telephone line was cut off. We were waiting for orders from our command. Everywhere, our troops' situation was chaotic. What was I to do with my platoon? And with you? I couldn't sleep that night.
No one in Saint-Martin could sleep. People cried, "The Germans are coming." The Italians were afraid. They wanted to run away. The Jews wanted to run away with the Italians. Some rushed to pack their bags. Others were still unsure. At Villa Paradiso, Vera, Rima's little sister, wanted to go to Italy with the whole family. But the parents didn't feel strong enough to cross the mountains, and the two sisters were worried about having to abandon them. Rachel tried to reassure them, saying at their age they weren't in any danger and no one would come to arrest them here. Before deciding, Rima at least wanted Federico's opinion.
On September the 9th at 10 a.m., I received an order from command to go to the pass. I immediately took measures for an orderly retreat, but we have barely begun our preparations when a first wave of fugitives appeared. I then decided to go by car to Saint-Martin, where I found your mother and many Jews. I told them of the various possibilities for flight.
Rima decided to follow him to Italy with her sister. Their parents would stay in Saint-Martin. Before it was time to go, Gregory placed both his hands on Rima's belly and gave her a blessing. Rachel watched her two daughters moving into the distance with the tide of refugees.
We saw devastating scenes. Children were crying, women who had gathered a few things in a hurry. I felt a duty to do everything I could for these Jews who had put themselves in our hands. Then I realized that we had to try to organize this escape. That night, at the foot of the slope leading to the Cerise Pass, I managed to gather a group of Jews, about 400 people, I think.
The climb towards Italy began for the fleeing former occupying army and the Jews of Saint-Martin. Through the Cerise Pass, or the Fenestre Pass, 2,500 meters. Suitcases which were too heavy were thrown into the ravine. A few Italian soldiers helped carry luggage or children. They said, "Passi lunghi e piani." Take big strides, but slowly. Most of the refugees were climbing the mountain in summer clothing without the right shoes. They were walking towards their last window of hope. Rima leaned on her sister and on Federico for the difficult parts.
It was a long march, which really tired out your mother, given her delicate condition. That night, we made a big fire in the undergrowth. It was very cold. But you were nearing my home. A wonderful dream was coming true. The next day, you reached the pass at noon and got back on your way shortly thereafter. I watched you as long as I could, with my jacket turned up so the soldiers wouldn't see the burning tears running down my face.
Federico had to stay longer in the barracks in the mountains. But Rima and nearly 1,000 refugees crossed through the two passes and arrived in Valdieri or in Antrac in the province of Cuneo between September 9th and 13th, 1943. They didn't know that the Allies were still much farther south, too far away to save them. That the Germans whom they had fled on one side of the Alps were waiting for them on the other side. They had already invaded northern Italy and had just occupied the province of Cuneo. They also didn't know that on the French side, as soon as they entered Saint-Martin-Vésubie, the Nazis had arrested all those who couldn't flee or hide in villagers' homes. At Villa Paradiso, Rachel managed to pass for a non-Jew. Gregory was arrested and deported. He would never return from Auschwitz. Almost as soon as they entered Nice, The Gestapo, which had been preparing their revenge for months, had already rounded up hundreds and hundreds of Jews. The Italians were quickly replaced. The Fourth Army was disbanded. The rout saw thousands of Italian soldiers still fleeing France when they weren't arrested by the Germans, returning home as quickly as possible, no longer obeying any orders.
Poor army. We ended so miserably, victims of an absurd and dangerous dream cherished by a handful of madmen. Such a tragic fate for my homeland.
Without any soldiers left, Strobino raced to join Rima and Vera. They caught a train to Turin, full of soldiers in a rush to get home, so panicked at the idea of coming across Germans, they'd already abandoned their uniforms. The next day, they arrived in the family village. Federico introduced Rima and Vera to his parents, without telling them anything about their love story. His mother Valentina didn't ask any questions, and made room for them in the house right away. And his father, Luigi, was worried about the two young women because Jews were being hunted by Germans throughout the region. A very large number of the refugees from Saint-Martin-Vésubie had already been arrested. More than 300 were held at the barracks in Borgo San Dalmazzo and then deported. Only 12 of them would return. Some escaped being rounded up by hiding thanks to the church or farmers. Federico moved Rima and Vera into a hut in the middle of the mountains. Staying in the house would be too dangerous, both for her and for the Strobino family. All those who hid Jews received death threats. Nazi fascist militias combed the valley. Freed by a German commando squad, Mussolini created a new government, the Republic of Salo, controlled by the Germans. The country fell into chaos and civil war. Italy was cut in two, divided between fascists and the resistance. Federico refused to report to the fascist authorities, so he was not allowed to work and had no money. He left Rima, now nearly 8 months pregnant, in the care of farmers in the mountains, and set out for Genoa to find a way to make a living. He even risked studying geography. The city was under constant bombardment. He received letters from Rima. You know, in French, they say that distance is to love as wind is to a flame. I think of you every day, every hour, almost every minute. I'm always waiting for you. I kiss you forever, Rima. A few weeks later, on January 18th, 1944, a letter told him of the birth of Mario, 2 kilos 85.
I felt deeply and completely overcome. I had never imagined such rich emotions. I was dying to know you. But at that very moment in the Biella region, the Nazi fascists were carrying out a vicious roundup, so it was impossible. Two months later, on March the 17th, after a very dangerous voyage, I finally got to meet you in person. You were skinny, but I thought you were beautiful. fate gave me the joy of seeing you grow and grow strong, away from any danger in my family's home village, during one of the more difficult and dangerous times for your gentle existence and for ours. The war raged more terribly than ever, on all fronts. The more the Germans lost ground, the more they carried out ferocious, frenzied attacks on all the population still under their control. But another, more painful war was brewing within us, a war which would lay waste to all my hopes.
Federico had to go back to Genoa to work. The distance wore on. Rima's letters grew sadder. I don't understand why we've only received one letter from you. I hope I'll have more soon. It's easier for you to write to us, because each letter in Italian is a very difficult undertaking. I'll end this here, because even speaking tires me out. I'll write to you the day after tomorrow. Yours affectionately. Here is a kiss from Mario. Federico argued with Rima more and more often. They were caught up in everyday life, household problems, cleanliness. Federico found Rima too messy. Listen, she replied. I'll give you some friendly advice. Find yourself a nice little Italian woman, pretty serious, not very intelligent, whose ideal in life is a well-scrubbed staircase. At least that will be better than a woman who would rather give mathematics lessons than clean your filthy socks.
I am as I am. Take it or leave it, she said. Her unwavering determination not to sacrifice any of her habits spurred me to the first serious estrangement. After Easter 1945, I had a very serious argument with your mother. And then, on April 24th, 1945, the Germans abandoned the region. The fascists surrendered. Resistance fighters occupied the country. The Germans surrendered unconditionally. Anglo-American troops ended their occupation of Piedmont. The war was over. You were now definitely, absolutely safe and sound.
And in spring 1945, as the war came to an end, so did the relationship between Rima and Federico. Federico wasn't identified as Mario's father. The little boy bore the last name of Rima's first husband, Levin, although he had committed suicide in New York in July 1943. It hurt Federico not to be able to give him the Strobino name. Rima went back to France with Mario. She wrote, "Our paths may be separating forever, but that doesn't wipe away the past."
I look to the future with a confidence. You're my future. Now I'm counting on you alone. And I'm sure you want to deny your father's blood. Life is infinitely unpredictable. And after the most fearsome storms, the sun shines again, brighter than ever, in a sky that's calm once more.
L'amore, la vita, godere ti fa. Quando ti vedo vicino il mio cuore sempre parli che dici che sa. Gira, rigira, biombina, l'amore, la vita, godere ti fa. Quando ti vedo vicino il mio cuore sempre parli che dici che sa. Gira, rigira, biombina, l'amore, la vita, godere